Hello and welcome. Module on grant writing for artists. This program was brought to you by Creative Lattice, Parge, and Crit Connection. Creative Lattice is a free website for artists' professional development where you can find lots of videos like this one at creativelattice.com. We would also like to thank Public Art for Racial Justice Education for helping fund these programs and bringing equity to artist career development. We're joined by Ruth Lance. Ruth, do you want to give 2 sentences on Connection?
Hi, I'm Ruth Lance. Crit Connection was founded in January of 2001. It's a program where artists are connected virtually each month for studio visits or to share resources. And once connected, they're responsible for furthering those connections however they see fit.
Great. And you can learn more about that also at the Creative Lattice website. All right, so let's start talking about grant writing for artists. At the time of this recording, the Guggenheim grant is right on the horizon for a lot of artists, so we thought it would be an interesting one to get into. Um, First thing, preparation is always good. It's key. So researching your grant's goals, align with your work with their values. What do you think that is, Ruth? Aligning work with their values.
Well, I think it's important to realize if, you know, the grant asks if it's an environmental grant, if you fit into there, but also just thinking like if who funds the grant, I think if you align with their values or you know, if the Sacklers give all the money, do you feel okay with that? I think is
Yeah,
important.
yeah. And so you can find out a lot of that information from the grant websites, right? So like a Rauschenberg emergency health grant, will go to somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, and so they're really trying to support artists and support artists to have healthier lives. So all that said is try and save your time by ensuring that you're a good fit because all these grants are so competitive that it's really not always worth our time even applying to them. Um, I know I spend a lot of time prepping for the Guggenheim grant, but since I'm not a academic, my chances are very low. That said, the Guggenheim's like a big deal, so it's sort of worth applying.
Just like anything as an artist, I think it's important um, to decide where you want to spend your time, right? Applying for grants, applying for shows, making work, because
Yeah,
we only have so much time. So I think it's important to decide where you want to put it.
yeah. And like we have a budget for money, we should have a budget for time if we were responsible. All right, different grant types. So, we say grants, but they're not all the same, right? There's a project grant that will fund like your specific project, like if I'm making a new series of paintings or a big installation. Emergency grants will fund urgent needs, like let's say you have a show coming up and you need to ship the work there but don't have money for it. Fellowships will often give long-term support. Research grants are more academic. Residency grants, I don't know if I've heard of residency grants necessarily, but I mean, some grants will fund you to get more education, professional development, and those will fund skill enhancements. So,
Those often will fund education or workshops or sometimes residencies. So I feel like there's some overlap there.
yeah, there's a bunch of overlap. And that's, like in Connecticut, I think there's a government grant that will fund educational purposes for artists. And normally those are also lower amounts, so 3 to 1,000 bucks is what I've seen for those. There's grants that will engage the community. Those are also, I mean, that's like another great one for previously we said look at the grants goals, and community engagement is a big goal for a lot of grants. And then travel and art research. But I guess really the big ones are probably project grants, emergency grants, and then sort of a general slash like academic development. Would you say, Ruth?
Academic or professional development. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, setting goals. I love setting goals, and that's like a giant theme in a lot of our modules. So understanding why you want your grant, you know, just give me the money isn't necessarily good enough, even though I feel like for artists it should be. Um, what are your goals, both in grant writing and in getting the grant? Um, and that's something we'll talk about a little more further on, I think. But the goal of the grant writing, like we can get a lot out of that, right?
Yeah, you can learn a lot from writing the grant. And I feel like if your goal is just getting the money, it may not be the correct time for you to apply to the grant. If you can't think of anything other than I just want money,
Mhm.
then you may need to wait to apply to a grant. Because sometimes I feel like we all want money, right? But
Yeah.
if you don't have any other sort of goals in mind right now, maybe
Yeah,
it's not your time.
a grant like the Guggenheim or Creative Capital, they're always asking like, why this grant? Like, why? What can these grants do for you professionally that's bigger than just the money? Um, which a lot of it is getting a stamp of approval from someone else, right? That in artist careers is a big one. But some other goals are like networking. So most grants have like a larger network of artists that have gotten the grant that you can tap into. There's of course funding, getting money, and then there's always getting clarity in your writing. So having a better understanding of what you do. You good on that, Ruth?
Yeah, or even just, like thinking about planning for the future of a show or,
Hmm.
planning for applying for something even larger or academic job or however that can help you, you know?
Yeah. And
So,
that's, if you go back to your other goals, like what is your next level, and how does this grant help you get to that next level, whether it's the academic or the show.
mm.
So most grants, you need some sort of narrative. It's not good enough to say just give me the money. Um, so wouldn't it be great if like they didn't ask for like a full page and you could just say
Money, please.
money please in my pocket. Um, So in your narrative, be sure to avoid having too many ideas. I know I'm definitely guilty of that in most of my writing. I am an artist who has many different projects all at once, and I like to tell people about all the projects at the same time, and that does not work. So avoid having too many ideas is a big one. Starting with a strong hook to get the readers emotionally involved. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And so that's the connecting emotionally. So it's not just like I make art, and having it be like the same type of writing that is taught in graduate school.
Make it personal if you can.
That's yeah, emotional is personal, right?
Hmm.
So personal, and then keep it specific and keep it to what you make sure it's what you're talking about. Because we like to end up going off on tangents. I think that's the too many ideas thing. Um, so simplify your narrative. I always love the idea of like a narrative is like a story, and in the story, like you, the artist, are the protagonist, and usually an event happens, and the artist reacted by doing X. So, like it's not a great narrative, but it's saying like, during like COVID happened and I became a licensed foster parent in order to find more connection with my community. And so that's also, as you just saw, like it wasn't like COVID happened and I became a foster parent, but I also introduced my motivation. So the why, readers love knowing why the protagonist is doing their X.
And
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be complicated, right? Like simple narrative. Like we
Hmm.
all have a reason why we do something,
Yeah.
you know? And that's where the personal aspect comes in because it's all very Everyone's reason for doing something is a little bit different.
Yep. And a lot of this, if this is where grant writing is great because it also leads into your statement, right? Like whatever your artist statement is, and we have a module on artist statements, but I always love leading my artist statement with the same thing. It's an emotional hook to get the readers involved. Again, why this grant? Grant readers. So this is like also from the perspective of somebody, because we're writing something, but somebody has to read that. And the person reading it often wants to know why this grant is important versus like why don't you just get a job, or why aren't you going after this other grant? Like why do you want the money that I'm in charge of giving out? Um, and so highlighting that need for funding is important. We also need to think about current funding trends, which like community engagement right now is really big. So if you can work that into the grant somehow, that's important. Thinking about like diverse backgrounds and the diversity, equity, um, and inclusion is still big in the funding world. So where are you coming from, and make sure to say that. I was just reading an artist statement, and they were a person of color, and they did not mention that at all in their artist statement, and I thought that that was really interesting. And they didn't want to, I mean, they didn't want to like be the one pointing the finger at it, but if they don't do it, nobody's going to know. For the for the grant, it's pretty important.
But I
Um,
also think, I also think that you shouldn't mold your work to fit the moment, right? So just make sure that you're honest about what your work is about, and you don't try to um, make your work. You don't change your language or you change your belief to fit the grant.
yeah,
So that
totally.
makes, yeah.
I mean, that's a big problem with like when I started working with nonprofits, like the idea of where their funding comes from. And I was told very early on that like we could easily go for grants, but then the projects end up getting molded for the grants, um, which is like, yeah, something that as artists, we do not want that to happen. That said, like when I say like tell them your background, some grants do have like um, they have a section for your bio, but I think it's always good to put like one sentence about your background in the other place in the statement or something, because it does inform the reader about who you are, and it doesn't have to like necessarily be like what your work is about, um, but I think it does like inform them about who's making this work.
I agree with that, but just don't reach too far out of.
Yeah, don't
Yeah,
reach, don't lie. You know, you can still be honest, and but I think it's often like we don't like. I think young artists especially like don't want to be pigeonholed and don't want to say too much, and I just think it's important to say a little bit. I think it's it becomes helpful, I think. Um, all right, aligning your work samples. I've been guilty of this in the past where like I write this whole two-page thing for a grant, and then my work samples aren't really what I was talking about. And as I'm reviewing my Guggenheim right now, I'm seeing that I'm sort of doing the same thing, that like I'm not like I looked at all of my images and they were all blue, and yet I don't really address that in the writing. And I think somebody looking at it with fresh eyes is going to ask that question. So try and look at your images with fresh eyes and make sure um, that you're actually writing about that in the narrative. Um, I
and I also think with your images, you could also tell a narrative.
oh
So
yeah, definitely.
think about how you're ordering them, right?
Yep.
Because even that you can like follow the narrative of your grant with the narrative that throws flows through your images. So it should all work together.
Yep. And eventually we're going to have a module on images specifically for like this. Um, but it is important, and oftentimes, like I know the NIFA grant, they project the images on the wall, four at a time. Um, and that's something very valuable to know when you're putting your images together, if there's going to be four of them right next to each other. So, it leads into later on, we're going to talk about reaching out to the grant people, and that is an important question that we will often want answered. Um, that said, make sure to use highest quality images. I mean, we all should know that already, but don't use bad quality. And I also I had a grant recently where the person thought that I had bad quality images, but then it just turned out they were watching it on a bad computer. I thought that that was pretty unfortunate.
I
Um,
feel like, we also as artists have to accept there's so many things that we send it out and there's so many things we don't have control over.
yeah,
Like the people, reading the grant may just be hangry when they're reading our grant. They could just be need lunch.
yeah,
And so there's just so many things we don't have control over.
yeah,
Um,
totally. I think there's something about that with court cases, right? That judges are more likely to convict right before lunch.
I, I don't
Yeah,
know, but
I remember listening to something about that where it's a really weird small statistic, but it does make a difference. But there's no way that we can change any of that. We just put it out there. Um, Ruth, do you have a thought on? I've always thought that if so, images come in kind of four different styles. There's an installation shot. There's a um, there's a closely cropped shot where it's cropped to the edge. If this is the two-dimensional, let's say painting or drawing, there's a closely cropped, and then there's sort of an image on the wall type of shot where there's background, white background, and then there's a detail. So those are four different types. And usually I stick to one format of either closely cropped or on the wall. I don't mix those two up. And then I'll often start with a bigger installation view and then go into individual images interspersed with some detail shots. I don't know if you have a thought on that.
yeah, I usually do closely cropped images. I always start with a singular image, and then the second one is not a detail, but a installation, and then um, I'll interweave images and details. And
Yeah,
then I usually well, not always, but then there's always at least one other um, installation shot.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's worth thinking about that, and that's where peer reviews are good. So ask an artist friend to look at your images. Very important. And then avoid unrelated work. So the Guggenheim asks for 20 slides. If you don't have 20 slides, or you feel it's if all of your work is sort of the same and it's conceptual, then you don't need to fill every spot. Um, and so, so keep it on point is better than just filling in to fill in. Budgets. So budgets should reflect the true cost of your grant. Make sure you include a stipend for yourself. Artists should be able to get paid, and often grants will appreciate paying yourself. Um, it's I think it's important. It's not that important, but often grants will like you to show that other places are giving financial support, and that includes in-kind donations. So let's say my wife's a graphic designer and is helping to design a catalog that is part of this grant proposal. That's an in-kind donation and should be noted that this designer is donating these hours. It shows that other people have a vested interest. Um, adding a buffer. I think you spoke about adding a buffer, right, Booth? Ruth?
Yeah, basically it's just, no matter what you do, there's always going to be things that happen. So just adding a 20% buffer that's like unforeseen or um, extra supplies or, just a buffer of cost that
Because they're
will
going to be
come up. Yeah.
and they might also not fund the whole thing. So let's say you ask for $2,000, they might only be able to give you 1,600, and that buffer can also help there. Uh, Checking what's covered, you can always, you need to make sure if they're writing like we don't cover food for parties. That comes up a lot in some grants that I for my nonprofit group. They just don't cover food for parties. So make sure that you're not including that because that is they're like looking for reasons to say no and to take your application and put it in the discard pile. And so not following their rules is a big one. Um,
And technology is another one that comes up a lot.
Technology. So that means like a new computer.
Like a new computer or like a subscription to Adobe products or something like that. They often don't want to, software is more common even so than like a computer.
So things that are common categories are like stipend, travel, materials, um, equipment purchase. Like we just said, you have to make sure that one is covered because it could be considered technology. Transportation, space rental, future maintenance, insurance, fabrication, all those things. And all those things also think about them as in-kind donations too. So like a space rental, um, I showed at a museum space once where they often rented and we went for a grant and I put that as an in-kind donation because the museum was giving it to me for free. Um, and so that was sort of an important note. Use all your available resources. So we had a chat on this with one of our groups that somebody brought up that you should try and contact the grant coordinators. That it's usually somebody's job at these grants to be the like front-facing person and talk to artists who are applying. And so contacting them is both good in terms of it'll answer your questions. So you can ask them like, hey, is technology covered? I don't see that on your website, which is an important note too, because you should be checking their website first, because it's good to show that you've done the research. Because there's nothing more annoying than somebody getting an email and being like, yes, go to the first page of the website and you'll see the answer. But if you ask a good question, they might end up remembering you in the grand jury process, and so it's sometimes is beneficial for you to reach out, as well as attending any workshops. Often places like government grant givers give workshops. I know like the big grants end up giving workshops usually. So it's good to go to the workshops, or often they'll have recordings of them so you can watch them online too. Um, you can also
Some
read.
grant, I was just going to say, some grant coordinators will even read what you've written,
Mhm.
particularly if it's like a smaller grant, um, because everyone doesn't contact them, and sometimes they'll look over it.
Yeah, that's like probably for like the smaller regional grants, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
the Guggenheim, they're not. They're gonna laugh.
No,
They'll find that offensive if you ask them to read.
yeah, no. But for like a smaller regional thing,
Yeah.
you know, which
Yeah,
are which is where you want to start anyway.
yeah, and you can write to them and say, "Hey, do you have any input, like any advice for me in applying to this?" And sometimes they'll be willing to set up a meeting or something. Um, these like local government grants, especially, like there are people who are being paid just to do that.
Hmm.
Sometimes you can also reach out to past grantees and learn from them. Past grantees are other artists, and it's not good. I don't think like there's like a balance, right? You don't want to be too hungry and like being and pestering a bunch of people to ask them about their grant experience, but I think if you're like, genuine, and if there, especially if there's some connection, like you say, hey, I recently like saw your show at so and so place, and I really loved it, and I see you also got this grant. Like, would you mind sharing any tips? And then finally, seeking feedback post submission. So a lot of these grants are kind of long game too. Like you might not get it right away, and that's where like persistence is key. But seeking feedback from the grant giving organization afterwards is important. Um, that's like where I was talking about that jury that said that I had bad images, but they must have been looking at it on a bad computer. Um, and because like one jury member said it was bad images, the other one didn't. And I think it was just their individual computer, but that was interesting feedback, right? Like maybe I did have bad images and that's worth, um, or maybe the images like come out really bad in projector for some reason, but on computer they look fine. So that's valuable.
And I also think, even if you don't get any feedback, just getting your name out there and, you know, they'll see your name a couple times.
Well,
That is something that is good, just having your name out there floating around. Because the next time you apply for it, it may stick, you know.
term gain from that, yeah. So persistence and patience. Grant writing does refine your communication skills and it helps you narrow down what you're doing. I think that's, again, you don't want to be changing your work for the grant, but it does help you gain a deeper understanding of your work and how to communicate it to others. I think that's important. Um, so we approach each opportunity as a learning one, even though, these things are competitive and it's not always clear that we're gonna end up winning something. But then when we do, that's a big celebration. Um, and then I always kind of like the 20% rule that like my job as like putting these grants together is not like I'm not necessarily going to win and actually, win very, very few. But the job is to be in the top 20% of applicants, and that includes having good images, following the rules. It's surprising how many artists don't do that, and so you need to be in that percentage that do all those things. All right, so just a few more little tips. Follow them rules. Um, super important, but that's like the number one thing that they do to get, to lower the application pool. Starting with smaller grants, especially regional ones. So oftentimes also the local government will like list what some of the more regional grants are. So look at your resources. I think on this module website, if you go to our website on grants, we have a section for like more resources on where to find grants. Leverage any personal connections. Um, I remember there was like one grant where like I knew one of the jurors, but I didn't apply for some reason. Um, and that's very silly. Like, make sure if you know somebody who's on a jury, you should apply to that grant because it's much more likely that they're going to raise you in the standings. Um, and consider having diverse recommenders. That's also something where like a lot of grants like the Guggenheim want you to give them a list of recommenders, people who recommend you. And those people don't just have to be in the arts. They don't have to be like a gallerist or a curator or an artist friend. If your work is on ecology, it could be someone who does climate change work. So like sort of reach outside your box because art is also it's like a very diverse thing, right? And the reasons we make it isn't so clearly about just about, artwork in the art world.
And I also think just on the idea of recommenders, it's will be helpful for you, people, artists, to sort of have a list of recommenders that you can reach out to. because you don't want to use the same three every time because they're not always going to be able to do it. So if you can sort of build up a list that you can reach out to, um, it'll
Yeah,
just be easier for you in the long run.
I agree. And I don't know. I go back and forth to how important the recommenders are. I'm not like I've never sat on a bigger grant that has recommenders. Um, but I wouldn't overthink it too much. Is just my other thing. Like some people want to make sure that like their recommender knows their work 100% and is like a really good writer, and they have all these criteria for what makes a good recommender, and that makes it very difficult for them. Um, I'd say the having those criteria met are great, but like if it doesn't work, just like get the job done.
Yeah.
Asking for help, so using your network for support, that's very important, of course. Especially also like with helping in reviewing grants and you're reviewing your writing and your images, help in asking for recommendations. Think about your network, and hopefully you've built up a very thriving network, but I'm sure you know more people than you think you do that could help you. um, and forming little grant review groups can also be great. So if you know a fellow artist, I'm working with an artist on the Guggenheim now, and we're switching back applications back and forth, and we meet about it and talk about like how to make it better. Um, so I think that's very important. Just a quick second on AI writing and grants. We have a whole module on AI writing for artists. I think it's a great equity tool. I recently was writing a grant because I had Lyme's disease and the Rauschenberg Emergency Medical Grant, and because of Lyme disease, I had all this like brain fog, and it really helped clarify a lot of my writing. That said, like to really use the AI for grant writing, you need to also train it. So you can't just go into a fresh chat and say, "Hey, write me a grant for the Guggenheim." You have to like input information about yourself. You input information about the grant itself, about the Guggenheim. So it's important to like know how to work with the AI, know how to use your prompts effectively, like what you're asking for and in what tone you want it to write, all that stuff. And we go into that in a little bit deeper in our module. It's
Yeah.
also, yeah, Ruth?
I was just going to say, I think it's important to remember that AI will give you the most generic information
Hmm.
unless you have um, trained it because, it works on generics. Sorry.
And
And
it's
so I
not
just,
necessarily going to give you good writing, but it can give you a good start. And I think also if you upload, another thing I like doing is uploading what the grant wants. So like everything from the grant website, and then asking it what's missing in my proposal. Um, and that's another way to like just use it for advice.
it's a,
Use it to
it's a
brain.
great ideation tool. And I also think probably AI will start to be used more for people who didn't follow the rules,
Hmm.
for more applications that didn't follow the rules. AI or algorithms will start to weed those people out
Yeah.
so that, you know, humans don't have to go through everyone's.
Yep.
They'll just go through the ones that fall, the top 20%.
Yep. And then AI is also great for copy editing, so just spelling mistakes and grammar. You don't have to use it for writing. You can just ask it to make sure there's no like glaring issues. I think that's good. And then there's always something new. So somebody described it as like humans don't like to turn over the same rock twice. We're like we're pretty curious people, but we also don't want to waste our time. And so just because you tried the AI 6 months ago, it's always changing. So it's always worth like trying it again. It doesn't take all that much time. And I just figured out in another application that now to at least ChatGPT, you can upload images. Of course, by the time you're watching this, it'll probably be old news, but you can upload images with writing and numbers in them, and it can then put it into a spreadsheet. Or let's say I uploaded images of all of my medical expenses and then asked it to, um, put together a sheet of the medical expenses and project it 2 years into the future. And that saves me a whole bunch of time in putting that together. I also just used it recently for an art fair where people wrote their names and emails down, and it's really good at handwriting recognition now. So I didn't have to do all that by hand. And so that is also another great, there's lots of great uses, but we have to figure those out. Rubrics real quick. So a rubric is sort of the rules that a grant writer or grant reader is going to go on. So when they're reading your grant, sometimes they'll have like a real more strict rule book on how many points they're giving you for hitting each thing. So, like artistic merit, your project feasibility. So, is this something like, are you proposing to go to the moon with their $2,000? Like, that's not going to happen. So, they're not going to give you the grant. Um, Relevance and impact of your project. So, who's it going to be affecting? The impact of your grant on your own career is another one. Your professional experience. And these are sort of, I think these are in order of most rubrics, like how much credence they give each one. So artistic merit is first, and then professional experience is further down the line, and then originality of your grant, and then sustainability, diversity, equity. Those often, we talked about diversity earlier on, but those get like a small bump in grant giving, and sometimes it's just like 1 point in the grant giving can make the difference. And then finally is emotional impression, and that's where you want to hook people with your narrative and get people emotionally involved, or leverage any people you might know in the grant program. And that, often grants will, like, they'll have like 100 applicants, they'll narrow it down to the top five, and then they'll select those top five based on which one the people like the most. Um, and that's just the tough truth. But in order to
And
get in that top five, you need to, follow the rules um, and project yourself in the best way possible. Ruth?
I was just going to say, sometimes if you are talking with the grant coordinator, you might be able to get a copy of the rubric.
Yep.
So, it's one of those things that doesn't hurt to ask.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, that's about it. We ran through the whole thing. You can find more info at creativelattice.com. Like to thank everyone for joining us, and please be sure to check us out online for more modules. Thanks.
Thank you.